Hello, my name is Steve Jindryzik. I've been teaching history here in Chicopee, Massachusetts for over 20 years. At an early age, as a youngster, I must confess I became fascinated with the history of my hometown. Chicopee dates back to one of the earliest settlements in the story of the United States. And as a youngster, I read Clara Steele Palmer's Annals of Chicopee Street. Mrs. Palmer captured the story of the early citizens, the Chapins. And from then on, I guess I was hooked. Along the way, a great many people have saved and shared the history of our hometown. And this program owes a great deal to them. And here in the opening moments, I'd like to give them the credit that is certainly due them. Certainly the Annals of Chicopee Street, which is available here at the local library, something of a rare book. The story of the first settlers, the Chapins. And along the way, the efforts of Charlie Seaver and Betsy Kerr to save the material of local history. And a special tribute to Ted Sotella in his book, The History of Chicopee, the one that got me started. So I hope you'll sit back, and for the next hour or so, I'll try to share with you the history of my hometown, Chicopee, Massachusetts. This is the Fairview Cemetery. The names on these gravestones represent 250 years of Chicopee's history. They started as farmers, graduated to be storekeepers, and by the 1890s they owned and operated the giant mills of Chicopee. Just like the valley's first settler, William Penchon, these men were hard-working, God-fearing Puritans. The initial settlement of the Pioneer Valley, of course, took place in what is now Springfield, Massachusetts. And before we begin our discussion of the history of our hometown, Chicopee, Mass., we've got to journey back to Springfield, England, in the time of Charles I. The gentleman's name was William Penchon, and he lived in Springfield, in the county Essex in England. William Penchon was a Puritan, and at that particular time the Stuart monarch Charles I was treating Puritans very harshly. Penchon joined with a group of other Puritan elders to form the Massachusetts Bay Company, and in the year 1630 they left for America. Unlike the Pilgrims, though, they were well prepared. They had sent an advanced party, and the initial settlement was in the vicinity of Salem, Massachusetts. The leader of their expedition was John Winthrop. Now, Winthrop became the governor, and Penchon the treasurer of the Massachusetts Bay Company. But that friendship and that mutual trust didn't last very long. When you read the history of the valley as written by Mason Green in the 1880s, Green implies that William Penchon realized that Winthrop and the other divines, now located in Boston, were seeking too much power. This power, of course, meaning that the individual freedoms in the colony were lessened. Well, we're not exactly sure, but Penchon sent two of his agents, two gentlemen named Woodcock and Cable, to explore the Connecticut River Valley. Their basic explorations took place in the vicinity of Agawam, Massachusetts. They reported back to their leader, Mr. Penchon, that they thought it would serve very well as a possible settlement. It should be pointed out that William Penchon was a very bold individual, but he also realized that the valley would provide a way of life as well as a means of making a living. The fish in the river, the fur, which was abundant, and the beavers that surrounded in the surrounding hills, and of course the fertile bottomland of the Connecticut was ideal for farming. William Pynchon and a small party of approximately 14 arrived in what is now the modern settlement of Springfield, first settling for a brief period on the other side of the river in Agawam, making peace with the Agawam Indians, and eventually purchasing the land on the other side of the river. The settlement was established officially in the year 1636. William Pynchon would remain in Springfield and help build the settlement by inviting individual settlers, artisans, and craftsmen to join him. But basically, Pynchon built up Springfield, and he built it up carefully. It would be fair to say that, unlike John Winthrop down in Boston, Pynchon originated, and although he is not given credit for, a town meeting system, or as it's called today, a selectman system. Although he never served as selectman, he was the magistrate and played a key role in the early history of the colony, besides being, of course, the richest man. There were a number of quarrels with the neighboring state of Connecticut, one in which Pynchon was accused of profiteering from the Indians. He was absolved of this charge, and it turned out that it was merely some jealous traders from the south, from Connecticut, who were upset that the Indians would not trade with them. William Pynchon, unfortunately, even though his great success here in the colony, setting up the settlement of Springfield, Pynchon, like so many men of his time, was very much interested in religion. And he spent many hours studying his faith, which was the Puritan faith. And he wrote a book. The book was called, or pamphlet at best, The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption. And very quickly, it was an effort to reinterpret the suffering of Christ, Jesus Christ, on the cross. And through his own using his own personal funds, he had the book published. Well, that was an error, because when the book was published in London, it eventually reached the New World, and it was read in Boston. And I should report to you, they didn't like it very much. They burned it on Boston Common. They ordered Pynchon to Boston to face charges of heresy. Now, I certainly am not a theologian. The basic disagreement was that John Pynchon said that it was the good life of Jesus Christ that redeemed us, not his terrible and tragic death on the cross. But John Winthrop and the others down in Boston didn't agree. And William Pynchon was forced to leave the New World. He left with his stepson and his second wife, leaving his son John in charge of the Springfield settlement. By now, a thriving settlement, growing almost daily. Pynchon returned to Springfield, England in 1652. He would live for 10 more years in the quiet settlement, and he would be buried there. Needless to say, the settlement at Springfield is named for William Pynchon, his hometown in Springfield, England. John Pynchon is the first name we discover in the annals of Chicopee Street, the history of Chicopee. He was awarded a land grant through Massachusetts Bay Colony for what would become the initial settlement of Chicopee. It was to extend along the Connecticut River all the way to an area known as Willimanset, or as it was called in those days, Willimanset. All the way to Squattagunnick Falls, which is the original name, the Indian name for Chicopee Falls, and all the lands along both the Connecticut and Chicopee rivers. Now, apparently John Pynchon never took advantage of this grant, but he did turn the land over to Deacon Samuel Chapin. And it's the sons of Deacon Chapin who were the original settlers of what would become Chicopee. We're in the First Congregational Church of Chicopee. This particular building was erected in 1825. Today we're going to be talking about that early history of Chicopee, Massachusetts. The first residents of Chicopee obviously weren't Puritans. They were Nonotuck Indians, and they lived on the bluffs, which today is an area called Indian Park in Chicopee. The Nonotucks probably sold the land to William Pynchon. The date is somewhere in the early spring of 1641. We have no real records of that sale, but Pynchon was buying a great deal of property in the Springfield area, and he was buying it from the Indians. This particular purchase we have a record of, although we don't have the real deed. Apparently, he bought land on the east side of the Connecticut River, from the mouth of the Chicopee River to a brook called the Willimantic Brook, which would be located just about where the brook is down below Bellamy School today. That was the first land grant in what we call Chicopee. The first residents of Chicopee, those Nonotuck Indians, are probably responsible for the most commonly held meaning of the word Chicopee, namely Birch Bark Place. It's also been called River of Elms and quite another of an assortment of names by assorted historians. But I like the one about Birch Bark, because if that is indeed the case, that's how Chicopee became known. Initially, the Indians used dugout canoes, but the Nonotucks and a number of woodland Indians perfected the birch bark canoe, which, as you can guess, was light and very, very fast. But in 1641, the Nonotucks departed the area, probably heading north, eventually to be bought out again by that same man, William Pynchon, and finally to move on to Canada. In the year 1659, Samuel Chapin, who was better known as Deacon Samuel Chapin, purchased land from John Pynchon, William Pynchon's son. He purchased land on both sides of the Chicopee River. One plot at Lower West Street, in the vicinity of the Post 452, and the other down here on Chicopee Street, approximately at the location of the Cavalier Restaurant. His two sons would build their homes. Jacob would build his home here on Old Chicopee Street, or as it became known, the Hadley Road. And his brother, Henry, would build his home on Lower Exchange Street, and very soon his brother-in-law, Roland Thomas, would build a home. Seems both young men were getting married, and as was the custom at that time, you built a home before you married. Everybody pitched in and helped, and it was done very, very quickly. They were very modest homes, we're told, as were most of the settlement houses along here. There was quite a large pasture that went with the land, and the Chapins are Chicopee's first settlers. The year is 1664, and nearly 100 years will pass. 100 years before the Reverend John McKinstry comes to Chicopee. He comes to start a congregation. After petitioning the legislature, the citizens of this area, Chicopee Street, will have their own meeting house. There are several old homes still with at least ties to the old Chapin family and to the McKinstrys. But in this old church, built in 1825, just a few yards from the original meeting house, we can still feel the spirit of Reverend John McKinstry. In 1752, the early settlers of Chicopee secured the meeting house and established their own parish here in the Outward Commons. The major reason for the establishment of the parish had to do with the difficulties of fording the river on a weekly basis in winter to attend services in Springfield. In fact, the settlers forded the river right about here, in what even today is still called the Old Indian Waiting Place. In 1757, there was a war going on in Europe. Over there, they called it the 7 Years' War. In America, we called it the French and Indian War. A number of the settlers of our little village participated in that war. Deacon Edward Chapin, for instance, served at Ticonderoga. Moses Chapin was captured at Lake George. And perhaps the most famous of those early settlers, Captain Elijah Chapin, the commander of Fort Massachusetts at Hoosick, was killed by Indians during an attack. The war was over, and England now dominated the North American continent. The French were defeated. Edward Chapin journeyed down to Boston in 1774 to serve in the legislature. The king dissolved the legislature. Chapin remained in service at Concord, but in April of 1775, a man named Israel Bissell thundered into this valley, carrying the news of the outbreak of the American Revolution. We're here in the old Chicopee Street burying ground. According to the records in the Springfield Public Library, over 25 Chapins from this parish, from Chicopee, participated in the American Revolution. Most of them are buried right here. Perhaps the greatest single alarm of the American Revolution took place in September 1777. The Great Battle of Saratoga. According to records, 20 Chapins were there. The most famous, a captain named Ephraim Chapin. He's buried here, participating in the War of American Independence. When the war ended, though, there'd be serious problems in the valley. The Chapins would be affected as farmers. There'd be a shortage of hard currency. And for several years, times would be hard here on old Chicopee Street. But in the mid-1780s, one of the great events in American history sweeps right down this old post road. Out of the Pelham Hills comes Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays and his regulators marching on the courthouse in Springfield. It was January 1787, and the desperate farmers led by Shays marched right down the old Hadley Road. They spent the night in the old covered bridge, and then the next morning they marched on the arsenal at Springfield. Waiting for them were a band of militia led by General William Shepherd of Westfield. They turned aside Shays' attack, and in the snow, Shays and his army escaped back across the old Chicopee meadows, spent another night in the covered bridge. Legend has it that many spent nights in the homes of the Chapins along Chicopee Street. They were now an army in full retreat, for coming from Boston was General Benjamin Lincoln and 4,000 state militia. The escaping rebels, called regulators, slept in the homes at night and then escaped. Lincoln's army was only a few hours behind. Eventually, they would pursue Shays all the way to Petersham, and the rebellion would be over. He would escape to Vermont, and his rebels would surrender. A few months after Shays' rebellion at Philadelphia, a convention was held, ostensibly to reform the Articles of Confederation. But before it was over, they had created a constitution for the United States and a new president, George Washington. As we stand holding the symbol of Shays' rebellion, the sprig of hemlock, standing in this fresh snow, we can remember back to that cold January day in 1787, when a ragged army raced across this same ground, perhaps never knowing that their furtive rebellion would change the course of American history and probably the course of history of the Western world. As Shays' rebels were surrendering in Massachusetts, a young man named Samuel Slater was a textile mechanic in England. A year later, Slater would be on his way to America, carrying in his head the secrets of the English textile industry. He'd arrive in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and there he'd go to work for a man named Moses Brown. Together, they'll start the Industrial Revolution in America. Brown's mill would become Slater's mill, and would become America's first textile operation. The year was 1790. Basically, textiles meant cotton. Cotton was grown in the South. The South's older crops of indigo and rice and tobacco weren't bringing in the profits they had previously. Cotton seemed to be the answer. There was no doubt that the English textile mills would buy all the cotton the South's farms could produce. Except there was a major problem connected with the harvesting of cotton. Besides the fact that it required a large supply of labor, enslaved labor, the bigger problem had to do with separating the cotton fibers. The seeds, which were connected with a sticky material, had to be removed by hand. The problem was costly, and it made the harvesting of cotton somewhat unprofitable. The year was 1792, and a young man from Connecticut named Eli Whitney was visiting the South. Whitney observed the slaves meticulously separating the cotton fibers. After getting permission from his host, he sat down in the workshop and built a simple machine. That simple machine, called the cotton gin, would perpetuate the cotton kingdom. It would ensure the success of Southern cotton planters and would mean that slavery would become an integral part of the South's economy. The English had been the South's best customer for its cotton, but the Embargo Act of 1807 and the War of 1812 had reduced the amount of cotton being sent to England. The Southerners were looking for other areas to sell their cotton raw materials, and they'd find it in a rather strange place. The basic source of power at this time was water, swift streams and rivers, and New England was loaded with them. New England also had something else that's necessary for a successful business: capital. Their names were the Boston Associates. They're a shadowy group of merchants and, well, mostly merchants, but also sea captains, who had made a fortune in the China trade. They'd made millionaires in Salem and Boston, and now they were looking for a place to invest their money. A few months after the Battle of New Orleans, a young Bostonian, armed with the support of the Boston Associates, was on his way to England. His name was Francis Lowell. Francis Lowell traveled to England to learn all he could about the textile industry. With the unlimited financial backing of the Boston Associates, Lowell returned to America and in the early 1820s planned and built America's first industrial city. That was on the Merrimack River at Lowell, Massachusetts. And there he established several manufacturing operations, most of which was totally funded by the Boston Associates. The Associates, as I said a little bit earlier, a shadowy group of merchants and businessmen and sea captains. One of the gnawing notions about American history is that many of them also made their money in the forbidden slave trade. Whatever that may be, they invested huge sums of money into the town of Lowell, Massachusetts. In 1822, they sent Joseph Hall Jr. and Joseph Brown right here to the falls in Chicopee Falls. There they met with Edmund Dwight and his brother Jonathan. And there they negotiated the purchase of this entire tract from Benjamin Belcher. And thus began the works for the establishment of a textile mill here in Chicopee Falls. The Boston and Springfield Company was incorporated on January 24th, 1823. It was more than just a textile mill. It was a canal company, a machine shop. It had licenses not only to operate textile machinery, but also to build textile machinery. It was an elaborate company. It would depend for its power on this river. It was incorporated for the huge sum of $500,000. The Boston and Springfield Company purchased most of what is now modern Chicopee Falls from the Belcher family. They were more than just a mill. To the rear, you see the original buildings constructed in 1825. The company was a mill, all right, but it owned most of Chicopee Falls. It owned the water rights. It built a canal, built tenements for the workers, laid out a school district, planned streets, and began to build a community. The Lowell plan was patterned after the British system. The textile mills would produce cloth. It was a labor-intensive industry, and there was a need for many workers. Most of the workers on the floors of the mills in Europe were women. The need would be the same here, except this was Puritan New England, and there would be a different set of rules here. For one thing, the company would have to guarantee an attractive factory atmosphere, which they did. Girls were recruited from Belchertown and Granby and West Springfield. Their families were expected to visit on Sunday to make sure everything was fine. The rooming houses that the girls lived in were under the scrutiny of very strict control of ladies who were hired from the community to maintain a gentle and above-board operation. And apparently they were quite successful. The girls were paid about $2.50 a week for a 12-and-a-half-hour day, which, of course, by our present standards, is a very long workday. The Boston Associates had provided an enormous amount of capital to this region. $500,000 was followed by several more investments over the next several years. The Boston and Springfield Company would become the Chicopee Manufacturing Company. But there would be no smooth progression, no development of industry. Overnight, Chicopee would become an industrial center. In fact, the entire nation was being swept by the Industrial Revolution. But here in New England, dynamic change was taking place almost daily. The Industrial Revolution was the catalyst. Change was taking place on an almost daily basis. But as so often is the case, there are those that are hurt by those changes. The farmers who farmed the land that surrounded the Chicopee Manufacturing Company were finding that they were having great difficulty selling their products. Cheaper Ohio River produce was flowing in to the port of New York through the newly constructed Erie Canal. The farmers were unable to make a living. They had to make a momentous choice. Go to work at mills like the Chicopee Manufacturing Company, or pull up stakes and head west. For those who remained in the valley and didn't head west to Indiana and Illinois and out on the Oregon Trail, a very unusual adventure lay ahead. Textiles had started here in the valley, but now machine tools were taking their place. South of here, down the river, at Cabottville, the Dwight family would establish the second industrial site on the Chicopee River. This is the main branch of the Chicopee Public Library, located in Market Square, approximately less than 100 yards from the old Ames Mill Complex. In 1829, James Tyler Ames and his older brother, Nathan Peabody Ames, were enticed to the valley by the Dwight family and the Boston Associates. They came ostensibly to start a cutlery business and manufacture small hardware goods. But by 1831, they were in the sword business, similar to these two. Their swords were being sold in the United States, and they discovered a market in Europe. Nathan Peabody Ames traveled to Europe in 1835, and the company began to sell field artillery. These were turbulent times for the young republic, and in 1835, there was a war on in Texas. This is the history section of the Chicopee Public Library. As a youngster, I spent many hours here. Read about a man called Sam Houston, the one and only president of the Republic of Texas. Houston was called the Raven, and he led a rebellion against the government of Mexico. He was one of the Ames Company's best customers in the 1830s. Ames military equipment was at the Alamo with Davy Crockett. And today, if you travel in Texas, there's an extensive display of Ames military accoutrements at the San Jacinto War Memorial in Texas. In the 1830s, the railroad came to the Connecticut Valley, A couple of years later, Chester Chapin, a Chicopee native, used his investment capital and his enterprising genius to bring the railroad to the Cabotville area. The track was laid by the newly arrived Irish immigrants who were beginning to become a part of Cabotville. A few years later, in the 1840s, America went to war again, this time in Mexico. The soldiers of Zachary Taylor carried swords and accoutrements made in Chicopee at the Ames Sword Company. The Mexican War was fought to expand the institution of slavery. But even before the war was over, the former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, spoke in Chicopee at the Cabot Hall. He carried a message calling for the abolition of slavery. About the same time in Springfield, a wool merchant named John Brown was carrying on his business. Brown had tried to buy military weapons at the Ames Works, but James Tyler Ames had turned him down. So instead, he traveled up to Chicopee Falls, visited with a man named Timothy Carter, who had just organized a new arms company. Brown would become a customer of Mr. Carter's new company, and he would carry Carter's weapons to Kansas to continue the fight for the abolition of slavery. The great writers of New England, Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow, Whittier, were leading the fight for the abolition of slavery. But while that was going on, the freight yards nearby the Ames Company were jammed with goods on their way to the South. The account books of the Ames Company register the names of the states of Virginia, South Carolina, and Alabama. They were buying swords and military equipment to supply the state militia. The mission of that militia was to prevent a slave rebellion. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law. This made it a crime to help runaway slaves, but it didn't bother the people on Chicopee Street. The old homes on Chicopee Street had been designed with escape tunnels in the event of Indian raids. But now, during the height of the day, escaped slaves would hide, and at night, travel upriver on their escape route to Canada. In 1848, Chicopee had become a community, a town. Through the efforts of Timothy Carter and others, the 7,861 citizens of Chicopee were now part of their own town. In the 1850s, Chicopee was a growing industrial city. 60% of the workforce was made up of immigrant Irish. The Irish made their homes in the West End, or the Patches it was called. Chicopee produced textiles, boots, farm equipment, and above all, military equipment. Swords, field artillery, cannon, and pistols. The night John Brown rode into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he carried with him a pistol made in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. The nation was to begin the agony of the Civil War. The factories of Chicopee would work night and day, producing weapons. And every day, her young men would march off to die. This is Chicopee Civil War Memorial, erected by the Grand Army of the Republic in 1871. It registers the names of 680 Chicopee citizens who fought in the Civil War. From Bull Run to Appomattox, the citizens of Chicopee follow the tragic events of that war. But for the city itself, the Civil War years will be a period of major industrial expansion and industrial boom. The industrial boom of the Civil War years will create a need for more labor. The village won't provide it. Recruiters will head north and then all the way to the Canadian border. And before long, girls from the Canadian province of Quebec will make their way to the city. They'll work primarily in the textile mills, and it won't be long before their French-Canadian men will follow them to Factory Village. In the 1860s, something unusual also happened regarding Polish immigration. In 1863, there was a civil war, a revolution against Russian rule in Poland. The end result was a Russian victory. And the refugees from the Polish Civil War
headed for America. Most of them, a small number, would end up in Chicopee. Teenagers, far away from home, would provide an additional impetus to Chicopee's workforce during the Civil War. During the Civil War, all the factories of Chicopee were kept busy. But the Ames Works turned out 1,000 swords a day and employed nearly 700 people for the duration of the war. Here in Chicopee Falls, the most prominent family's name was Belcher. Bildad Belcher had the most successful business. He ran a farm machinery business which daily shipped farm implements to the farmers of the West who were providing food for the troops. But Bildad was kept very busy following the newspapers because he was following the exploits of his very famous nephew. This famous memorial in Chicopee Falls honors Arthur MacArthur. Arthur was born not far from here in the Belcher homestead. During the Civil War, he was called a boy colonel of the West. And on November 25th, 1863, Arthur MacArthur led the charge up Missionary Ridge and became a part of American history. MacArthur was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his exploits, and he went on to a distinguished military career. But here in 1942, the citizens of his hometown honored him with this memorial. Following the Civil War, one company here in Chicopee Falls will become world famous. The Lamb Knitting Machine Company will export knitting machinery to all corners of the globe. But in the early 1870s, Chicopee will be the site of a series of very damaging strikes, mostly in the textile industry. This is one of the most famous homes in Chicopee. It was owned in the 1870s by a man named Samuel Blaisdell. He was the most prominent cotton broker in the valley. A few hundred yards down the street was the home of Emerson Gaylord, one of the most powerful industrialists in the valley. And down a bit further toward Market Square, the home of George Dexter Robinson, who in 1875 was the congressman from Western Massachusetts. In the 1870s, Chicopee's most famous company was in financial trouble. The Ames Sword Company was making Dover egg beaters. But it's going to take the work of two men who live right here on Chapin Street. The father and son team of Silas and Melzer Mosman. They'll develop a whole new technique for working with bronze. They'll create the doors to the United States Capitol. And will probably create most of the Civil War memorials that'll exhibit the greens and city squares across both North and South. Their studio will be located right here on Chapin Street, in the barn behind the family home. According to local legend, the most famous statue ever created by the Ames Works was made here. It was made here when a young man in the year 1873 journeyed here from Concord, Massachusetts. He met with Silas and Melzer Mosman, and here they created an American masterpiece. The young man's name was Daniel Chester French. On April 19th, 1875, the statue was unveiled at Concord, Massachusetts. It was unveiled by Ralph Waldo Emerson to these immortal words: "Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world." Silas Melzer Mosman and Daniel French had created an enduring symbol of the American Revolution, the Minuteman at Concord. It's been 100 years since the American Revolution. And now a new progressive revolution is beginning to sweep America. One of the most prominent voices in that new revolution will be Chicopee's Edward Bellamy. This is the Church Street Historic District in Chicopee Falls. The 6 homes on this street harken back to the 19th century. The centerpiece of the Church Street Historic District is this rather modest, classic American Greek Revival house. Built in the year 1840 by Chicopee real estate man Harmon Rowley. In the year 1861, the property was sold to the Reverend and Mrs. Rufus King Bellamy. This is Rufus Bellamy's church. His name is still inscribed in the choir loft. When the Reverend and Mrs. Bellamy moved to Church Street, young Edward was 11 years old. Edward Bellamy will spend the remainder of his life in this house. In the year 1873, he'll write The Duke of Stockbridge. It's a story of the Shays' Rebellion as it occurred in the Berkshire Hills. It'll be the story of an unjust political system. Massachusetts in the 1780s. It'll be the story of God-fearing men forced to resort to violence against an unjust government. In the year 1880, Bellamy and his brother Charles will start the Springfield Daily News. But Bellamy will remain with the paper for only a short time, and he'll return to serious writing. In the year 1882, Edward Bellamy asked Emma Augusta Sanderson to share his life in this house. Within a short time, 2 children were born, Paul and Marion. And according to Bellamy, they had a profound effect on the future of his life. He now became deeply concerned about the future of America and about the future of his children. In the year 1883, George Dexter Robinson was the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the industrial situation in Chicopee was changing very, very quickly. The influx of Polish, French, Irish immigrants had turned Chicopee into a complex industrial community. Looking backward, Bellamy's most famous book was written in the small den at the top of these stairs. It was written in the year 1888, a famous year in American history. There were supposed to have been 10,000 strikes that year. The book appeared in a time of national crisis. In writing his utopian novel, Bellamy conceived a simple fable of utopian perfection. What happened even surprised the author. For that simple fairy tale of an ideal world in the year 2000 became the cornerstone, the model for social planning, and, of course, gave rise to the nationalist movement. The nationalist movement attacked the exorbitant rates being charged by private electric and gas companies in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In 1890, Chicopee became a city. 2 years later, the legislature passed a law saying that in Massachusetts, municipal ownership of public utilities was perfectly all right. The first city in Massachusetts to own its own electric company was the city of Chicopee. The year was 1895. In the 1890s, the nationalist movement had become a worldwide phenomenon. Thousands of Bellamy clubs were formed across America, Europe, and Japan. Letters poured into Chicopee from all over the world. But for a short moment, the name of Chicopee was on the lips of people from all over the globe. Today, this house on Church Street is a National Historic Landmark being restored by the Edward Bellamy Memorial Association. The house is a landmark to an age, perhaps the most exciting age in the history of Chicopee, the 1890s. Edward Bellamy was only 21 years old when they dedicated the Chicopee City Hall. Back in those days, it was called a town hall.
The date was December 21st, 1871. We're in the balcony of the restored City Hall. The building was designed by Charles E. Parker of Boston, and it is still, without a doubt, the most impressive building in the city. On hand were dignitaries and leaders from across the state. Chicopee now had a town hall. In the year 1889, a group of local leaders petitioned the state legislature to change the status of the town to the status of city. And in this very room, on the 1st of January, 1891, Chicopee industrialist George Sylvester Taylor became Chicopee's first mayor. The 1890s were a dramatic time in the city. It was a time of excited industrial growth. Two of the most prominent companies, one was the Overman Bike Company, which was located in Chicopee Falls and later in Chicopee Center. They produced the famous and very popular and successful Victor bicycle. In 1892, from Philadelphia and Chicago came A.G. Spaulding's and his world-famous sporting goods business. 1892 was an exciting year. But right here on Front Street, two young men were living in a rooming house on the corner of Grape Street. Their names were Charles and Frank Duryea. In a barn on the property, they were assembling an automobile. They leased part of a factory in Springfield, built their motor. And in 1892, they drove their motor car on the streets of Springfield. By 1895, they organized America's first motor car corporation and leased space in Chicopee Falls. By 1895, Charles and Frank Duryea had won America's first road race and had run a half-dozen races in Europe. The Duryeas were building the world's fastest motor cars in the Connecticut Valley. The year the Duryeas were building their car, a young fellow at Springfield College was making history. His name was Dr. James A. Naismith, and he didn't know it at the time, but he was inventing the world's most popular game, basketball. The following year, Dr. Naismith, working with the YMCA, organized America's first league. Interestingly enough, in those days, Chicopee Falls had its own YMCA unit, and a group of young fellas organized Chicopee's first basketball team. The history books don't tell us what they were called. We can assume they were called the Falls Y. Players were Jack Spence, Jack Sullivan, Jim Gloucester, Dexter Cook, and Captain Med Rummel. Had a pretty good record. They, according to the history books, won 3 games and lost 3 games. You often wonder if they realized they were making history, playing in America's first basketball league. The spring and summer of 1893 were filled with newspaper stories out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Millionaire banker Andrew Borden and his wife had been axe murdered. And on trial that summer in New Bedford was their 32-year-old daughter, Lizzie Borden. Lizzie was being represented by Andrew Fleming. But early on in his defense, Fleming called upon George Dexter Robinson, who lived right here on Springfield Street and was the ex-governor of Massachusetts. Governor Robinson met with Lizzie, decided to take the case. The rest, of course, is history. Lizzie Borden was acquitted of the murder, and Governor Robinson collected the unheard-of fee of $25,000 in the case. In 1893, the state completed the construction of the Willimantic Bridge. The bridge had been a very controversial project because of its location near Holyoke. This meant that the citizens of Willimantic would now be able to cross the bridge in order to find work in the growing mills of Holyoke, Massachusetts. By 1896, the population of now the city of Chicopee was 20,000. 1/3 of that number had been born in Europe. It was a time of dramatic change in the small community. For the first time, the sons of immigrants were voting. And we began to read in the newspapers about the Irish bloc. It was a time of a very dramatic national election. The candidates were Bryan and McKinley. William Jennings Bryan, the reformer, was supported by Edward Bellamy and, of course, by the Irish workmen. But Bryan lost the election of 1896. The conservative McKinley won. Gold was discovered in Alaska. And in the year 1898, the United States went to war in Cuba in what would be known as the Spanish-American War. Arthur MacArthur, who lived in Chicopee for a short time, gained fame as a major general in the Philippine campaigns and later became the military governor of the Philippine Islands. According to local historic records, about 18 men from the city served in the Spanish-American War, most of them in the 2nd Massachusetts Volunteers. And according to local records, we lost one man. His name was Timothy Fitzgerald. The Springfield Republican referred to Chicopee as a picturesque foreign colony at the turn of the century. 1/3 of the locals had been born overseas, and now many of them had children. It would be fair to say that half the community had an ethnic flavor, and that ethnic flavor was going to be carried into elections. It was a time of great national social change. And in 1900, Chicopee elected its first Irish-American mayor. His name was Dennis Murphy. The nation was going through a major social revolution, and so was Chicopee. Teddy Roosevelt became the President of the United States, and we were into the progressive era on a national scale and on a local scale, as the immigrants' voice in the village began to be heard through the ballot box. This is the old Fairview Cemetery. The memorials and gravestones chronicle 250 years of Chicopee history. The Chapins are here, the Gaylords, the Robinsons, and the Bellamys. But the time has come for the changing of the guard. The Yankee influence will fade as Chicopee enters the 20th century.